is Iglika Ivanova with the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. And thank you for connecting with us through the internet, Iglika.
Thank you for asking.
And welcome, yeah. You are an economist, I presume. You are...
I am an economist, locally educated at SFU and UBC.
All right. And you've been working with CCPA for a few years?
I have been working as a research economist here at the CCPA for about 4 years now.
All right, so you have a good sense of what's going on and with the budgets and political finances. The BC budget, you claim, is an exaggerated deficit. Can you just briefly tell us why do you think so?
Well, we've seen a long history with this government of exaggerating the budget deficits. If you look over the last decade at what the budget projections were for the deficit or surplus in the years we had surplus, what the projections were on the budget day and what they came out at year end, you see very big gaps. First reason why I think the budget deficit will come smaller than forecast is the government is projecting growth to be much lower than what the private sector expects it to be. So that's a conservative projection of growth and automatically reduces the projected revenues the government's expected to get and makes the deficit seem bigger. So the government's projected growth is 1.8% and private sector forecast is 2.2%. So that difference alone accounts for about $500 million less revenue that the government's projecting than I think they're likely to get. And the other reason why the budget deficit is going to come lower, I think, than what we see is the HST transition funding repayment. So because of an accounting artifact, the government's budgeting the entire $1.6 billion that we owe the federal government in this fiscal year. So we, the BC government, negotiated a 5-year contract to repay the transition funding for the HST in equal payments, $320 million a year, 5 years, no interest. And yet, this entire amount is being budgeted towards this year's deficit. So over half, essentially, of this year's deficit is just an accounting artifact. It's money we don't have to pay this year. We have to pay over 5 years. So there's no reason to budget for it in this year, except an accounting rule.
Yeah. So you were in the budget meeting when they lock up the doors and only reporters are allowed in. And you actually saw then that this $1.6 billion was being included in the deficit?
Yes.
You said that. And you know, as a matter of fact, that they are not really going to pay the 1.6, but we're only going to pay about 320 million a year. So why would they do that?
Well, it's an accounting rule. Apparently, that's what I was told, and I believe that. I mean, accounting rules don't always make sense to people like you or I. Yeah. And I don't have a problem with putting it on the books, but what I think we need is a little more transparency on the part of the government to say, listen, we have to put this on the books. That's how accounting works, but that's not actually money we owe this year.
Mm-hmm. It sounds very difficult for me to understand because when I have a mortgage, I don't put the whole mortgage in my yearly finances. I put what I pay for that year, not the whole $500,000 mortgage, right? So it is something very difficult to understand. You also have some other issues there, not just the 320 million converted into 1.6 billion, but you're saying that the actual deficit is something like $245 million.
Yeah, well, when you look at the budget document, it's available online, so all this information you can go and verify on the government's website. But basically, the budget shows what's being allocated towards different ministries to spend and what the government's expecting to take in from taxes. So when you compare what's actually allocated towards spending with what they expect to get in revenue, you see that the shortfall is only 245 million. So on top of that, and that's before paying the HST. So on top of that, you have to add the 320 million for HST.
Which comes 565. It becomes 565, which is still 1/5 of the 2.5 projected.
And because these are projections, and the government doesn't know whether the economy will be worse than they expected. There's usually what I call fiscal padding, but there's a little bit of extra put there just in case something bad happens. It's called contingency allocation and forecast allowance. So there's basically $600 million in this year's budget in contingency allocation and forecast allowance for this year. And the reason why this is surprising is it's not surprising to see a small amount there, but I think 600 million is a lot of money. And it's more than they usually put. They usually is about $200 to $300 million. So this is double the usual amount. And it's surprising because this is for the fiscal year that ended in April, or will end in the end of the 2011-12 fiscal year, right? That ends soon after the budget, a couple of months after the budget. And to budget that much in unexpected, contingency amount, it just seems too much. They've already registered most of their spending. They know what's come up. If there has been forest fires in the summer, they've already seen that, and they should be able to budget. There's very few contingencies that can come up in the last 2 months of the fiscal year. So what I think they're doing is they're making the budget look more stretched than it actually is. And that's very politically convenient for this government because this government is interested in reducing the size of government, in reducing funding for services. And it's easy to make that case to the population if you say, listen, we can't afford it because we have no money.
Okay, so it's an excuse to cut services.
I think it's an excuse to cut services or an excuse to not address the needs we've seen. Just less than a couple of weeks before the budget was announced, came out the big seniors critique from the ombudsperson on seniors care and what's happening in seniors care in this province and how what we have is inadequate, grossly inadequate to ensure that our grandparents age and die in dignity. So the government isn't doing anything to address this problem with this budget. There's nothing for poor children. There's nothing for families that are struggling. So the way that they justify that is that we can't afford to because the economy is low. But really, it's over-conservative
not charging taxes, not charging the taxes that they need. But you're talking of the children, and you also mentioned that there's a $50 per child that the government has allocated for education purposes. Or is it tax credit, the $50? Is actually money coming to parents?
It's not money coming to parents. It is a tax credit. So you first have to spend $1,000 in fees for eligible fitness and arts programs. So we know the federal government has this children's fitness and arts tax credit, and we know very well that the people who claim it are upper middle class people, the vast majority. People with lower incomes cannot afford.
Yeah, can I interrupt you for a minute? Is this you said the federal government? Is this the federal or the provincial government who's offering the $50 child tax credit?
The federal government has a child tax credit, and the provincial government's introducing a new one that's modeled on the federal.
Okay, another $50
exactly
more.
The same things that are eligible under the federal government's tax credit are now going to be eligible under the provincial tax credit.
Additionally.
Yeah. So, but the problem I have with this is that it's not going to do anything for the lowest income people who can't afford the fees to put their children into those programs in the first place, because you have to spend $1,000 to get $50 back off of your tax. So it does seem like quite a bit of an investment up front.
Yeah, how much is that investment, the total investment that the provincial government is putting out in the budget?
The total investment is $9 million. It's very small relative to the other programs we have, but it was one of their flagship announcements even though it is so small and doesn't benefit most people.
So what would you recommend they do with those $9 million instead of giving to a middle class or upper class that already has $1,000 to invest in their kids? How would you distribute it more egalitarian?
I would suggest, not just for these $9 million, but for every government spending, amount, to think about, are we spending the money to help the most needy? Are we helping the most marginalized, or are we helping people who are already doing relatively well?
How would you do that?
Well, one thing you could do is programs that benefit everyone, regardless of their parents' ability to pay. So for children, I would recommend, for example, putting the money into schools, because we know that a lot of schools have to do their own fundraising for playgrounds and for, things like that. And now we have fees. A lot of parents are being charged fees for their school, for their kid to participate in the school sports team. So instead of charging parents fee, then maybe fund the sports team so all children can participate, not just the children whose parents can buy them hockey lessons or take them to piano classes.
So you would rather have collective services for everyone rather than only those who can afford. There's another number that you mentioned is $237 million for the justice system. And you also have a problem with it, in spite of some people who say, well, look, the government is increasing the budget for the justice system. What is the problem you have with it?
Well, I don't have a problem with increasing the budget for the Ministry of Justice, and we all know that there's huge backlogs, that people have to wait many years for their trials. But what I would like to see is more money being spent, again, on more marginalized groups who need it. We know that our legal aid program has been cut over the last decade to a bare shadow of its former self. And it's very difficult for people to get legal assistance if they don't have the money to hire a lawyer. So there is some more money going to legal aid, but it is a very small amount. It's about $2 million a year. And our research tells us it is inadequate to meet the need. We have a justice system that does not work for low-income people. They cannot get access to legal representation. They have to represent themselves, and as a result, they can't, benefit from the full extent of the rights they have. They can't get their rights enforced.
So where are those $237 million going to be spent? If it's only $2 million on legal aid, which affects the neediest, the people that need most, where is those $237 million being spent?
Well, first of all, that's an amount over 3 years. So when you divide by 3, it's not that much money per year. And I believe, I'm not sure, I haven't looked into it in great detail, but I think it's going to be spent on maybe more time, for the judges or the courts, because we know there's big backlogs of court cases, and so you need more people to process them through. So I guess that's where it's going, but I think more money needs to be put in the legal aid programs.
There's another point you raised is the recreational property. Tax break on recreational property. That apparently is $476 million a year that the government forgoes in favor of people that can buy recreational property.
Well, again, I would like to put all the programs that are being introduced in this budget to the test of who does it actually help, right? And so when you look at this is a one-year program only until the HST gets phased out. But basically, it extends the new homeowner tax credit, basically, to recreational property. So now, not just for your first home, you get a tax rebate on your HST. And that's if you can afford to buy a new home. It has to be new construction. But this year, the government announced just for the next 12 months, essentially, there's going to be an additional credit for second home or a recreational property. So let's think about, and the threshold at which the tax applies is increased from a maximum of $525,000 value of your new home. Now it can be up to $850,000. So who can afford to buy two homes, new homes, up to $850,000 or recreational property? Like, these are the people who are benefiting. I think it is inappropriate to use our public resources to give tax breaks to people who can afford these properties.
Mhm. So you would rather, if the government invested some more money into social housing for the lower income people than give
That would
this.
be just one example. There's plenty of programs we can invest in and that desperately need government help. Let's focus on the people who actually need our support. And sometimes I see this reflected in the conversations I have with people. But some people say, oh, the government should reward in the people who are doing well for the choices they have made. And I really object to this. I don't think that our tax credits should be a reward for people who are already doing well. I think that tax credits, the tax and transfer system should be used to help people who are in need, not to reward people who are already doing well. We already have huge income inequality. Their large incomes are their reward. Enough. Let's not spend public money on rewarding the money further.
Yeah. Would you equate that same compensation of tax credits to people that already have something when we talk about RSPs?
I think the RSPs, it's a federal program, all right? So the provincial government can't do a lot except lobby the federal government. But I agree. I think RSPs are very expensive. It's one of our most expensive social programs. If you think about it, a year it costs the federal government about $9 billion every year to provide the tax deductions that are associated with RSPs. And I think that the annual contribution limits are too high because currently for this year, you can contribute, it's a share of your income, but the maximum is somewhere around $22,000. Well, who can save $22,000 a year to put into an RSP account and get it off the top of their taxable income? I think this is not a reflection of where most Canadians are at. If you want to encourage saving, but to some reasonable amount. Because we know when we look at average incomes, for example, and earnings, the median, so the middle of the distribution, half Canadians, even those who work full year, full time, earn less than $45,000 a year. So if half Canadians earn less than 45, then why are we allowing $22,000 a year to be exempt from your highest tax bracket and given a tax credit? I think that if you want to encourage saving, if you want to provide pension income, there's other more equitable ways to do that.
To the tune of $9 billion, did you say?
I believe that is the number, but I can check afterwards.
Well, okay, but it's a high number. It's a way of saying we will not charge those taxes, although we need that money for social services, but we're going to let you keep your money. Isn't it kind of bizarre?
I think it is, and especially now if you look federally at what they're doing with pension, pensionable age, increasing the age for OAS by 2 more years so that they don't have to provide income to the lowest income seniors at 65, it kicks in at 67. So you are trying to save money on the program for the lowest income seniors while you are giving money to the people who can afford to save.
And that would also affect employment because a lot of young people are looking for work, and as long as the older folks don't retire, they have to wait for another 2 years to inherit those jobs.
I guess if they're competing in the same sector.
Yeah. So, do you think that tax cuts is more a political ideology rather than a practical economic benefit for the nation, for all the citizens?
We've seen provincially in BC 10 years of tax cuts, right? So since the early 2000s, we've had very large tax cuts, several waves of tax cuts to personal income taxes, to corporate income taxes, to the point where we now have the lowest personal income tax for individuals who earn up to $120,000 a year. So that's not most people. And we also are tied for the lowest corporate income tax rate, with Alberta and New Brunswick. So we have the lowest personal income tax rate, the lowest corporate income tax rate. And it's very easy to see, have we all benefited? I mean, we have 10 years of experience with tax cuts. And if you go and ask most people on the street, do they feel like they've benefited from their tax cut? Well, I think most people will have not noticed they had a tax cut because it didn't work out to a lot of money at that average income level. It only got noticed by the people with the high incomes who saved a lot of money. Corporations certainly noticed their tax rate going from 16% or 16.5% to 10%. We've seen huge cuts. And what's happened as a result is we've really taken a hit. The public treasuries has taken a hit as a result of all these tax cuts. We collect less money now as a share of the economy. And we have less money to spend on the programs and services we provide. I mean, that's why we have a deficit, right? The deficit just means we have less revenues than the cost of services we want to provide. And why? Because our revenues as a share of the economy has fallen over the last decade. We used to collect about 12% of the economy in terms of taxes. Now we collect 10%. And so that drop is a big number. It works out to, close to $3 billion every year that we would collect now if we had the same tax rates as a share of the economy that we did in 2000.
And if we compare ourselves with some European countries like Northern Europe, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, I don't think we do collect nearly enough for the services that we need.
I agree. I think we could be doing better. We could be providing more services, and we certainly have a lot of need. You only need to go, and see we have the highest poverty rate in the entire country. We have huge problems with marginalized group, like Aboriginal people have huge problems getting into the labor market, their education system. We have problems with homelessness. We have problems with the seniors' care. And there was just a big report issued by the ombudsperson saying that seniors care in this province is inadequate and doesn't allow people to age with dignity. So we have all these problems. I haven't even started talking about the environmental crisis we're creating with our resource-driven growth. So a lot of need, but we're not addressing it because we're not willing to ask the people who are doing well to pay a little bit more.
Yeah, and according to Seth Klein, the people that understand the need for social services, specifically on healthcare, most people are willing to pay more taxes. So do you see a disconnect here between what people really want and what the government's agenda is? There's a disconnect.
I think there is, and it's becoming more and more apparent. I think we've seen a lot of surveys come out in recent weeks showing people are willing to pay more taxes. And there certainly is room, and we don't have to even compare ourselves with Scandinavian countries. We can compare our province with other provinces in Canada. We're taxing less than other provinces. We have the lowest personal income tax rate, the lowest corporate income tax rate. There's room here to improve, right, to collect more money without becoming the highest. Even if you didn't want to become the highest, be the average and you have more tax revenue.
We couldn't be lower than Alberta. I understand that Albertans pay little taxes because of their oil revenue. So they're probably paying less taxes than we do.
Well, according to the BC government and the budget, an individual making $120,000 a year will pay lower personal income tax than in BC than they would pay in Alberta.
Really?
Yeah. It's in the back of the budget. There's a nice little appendix. And our corporate income tax rates are the same. We have the same corporate income tax rate as Alberta at 10%.
And excuse for lowering corporate income tax is that if we don't do that, they will take their business somewhere else. So we will lose the little revenue that we still get from them.
There's a couple of things that we need to consider. First of all, currently, the only investments that's coming into BC largely is in the resource sector. We're getting people to invest in the gas we have, to invest in mining. So these resources are not going anywhere. And if other companies don't come in to invest, to develop these resources, we could develop them ourselves. Or, so we're not losing anything. As for other companies moving to other places, I would say, yes, the tax rate plays some role in the investment decisions of corporations. But what you need to think about is more than just the tax rate, because the main determinant of, the decision whether to invest or not is, do you believe you will have a market for your product, essentially. So when the economy is strong, when people have income and they're buying, then you will see investment regardless of the tax rate. And when the economy is weak, you can lower the tax rate all you want, and you still won't get a lot of investment and jobs. And this is what we're seeing now in Canada and over the past few years since we've experimented with corporate tax cuts. We haven't seen that much more investment. We haven't seen that many more jobs. Instead, we're seeing higher profits for corporations because that's what lower taxes do. They increase your after-tax profit. Then there's the hope that you will invest this into jobs, but really that's not materializing for Canada. And I think that the companies, yes, they need to make a profit, but I think they're making obscene profits, and they need to contribute to the community that their workers come from.
Through taxes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we're very thankful to CCPA for doing the research, and people like you bringing all these things that the average person don't know. But we've been doing this for 17 years, the alternative budget, and I noticed that the inequality between the rich and the poor has been increasing, not decreasing. So I wonder if we need some alternative political system, not just the alternative suggested political budget or alternative budget, but also an alternative political system. What do you think?
Well, I think that things have been getting worse in terms of poverty or inequality, but I see hope in the events of the recent year, especially. Inequality has really come out on the radar as a big issue that politicians have to address. We're having more conversation about inequality than I've ever seen in my short career here. I think people are a little bit,
turning around.
Yeah, I like to think so.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to see that you're hopeful about a brighter future, and I wish you well in your work there with CCPA. And I thank you very much for coming on the internet to talk to our viewers.
Thank you.
So thank you, Iglika. We'll see you again.